Hello and welcome to OPA GC Sociology, and today we're going to be asking the question, what is the functionist perspective of the function of the family? Bit wordy, but when it comes to theory questions in the family paper, the first sort of question we ask is, what is the actual function of the family? So before we jump into that, just for you to do now, 5 questions, 5 minutes. So just pause the video. I'll read out the questions momentarily, and then we'll feedback as well and see what answers you've got and if they're right. So what is the difference between a consensus and conflict approach to theory? What theory encourages diversity as a sign of choice? Outline 3 different types of alternative households. Outline 3 reasons why diverse family types are on the rise. And number 5, what is the broad definition for the family? So just pause it, give yourself a couple of minutes, and then we'll go over those answers. Right, so for number 1, what is the difference between a consensus and conflict approach to theory? So both consensus and conflict approaches both believe that structure influences society. The difference is that consensus approaches think those structures are good, whereas a conflict approach thinks those structures are bad. So you've got people like the consensus approach with theories like functionalism, and then the conflict approach, you have theories like Marxism and feminism. Okay, so if you to break it down in a sentence or two, you're just going to say consensus thinks structures are good for society, conflict think structures are bad for society. And then number 2, what theory encourages diversity as a sign of choice? Well, that's the postmodernists, and that's something we're going to be looking at in the coming weeks. And then number 3, outline 3 different types of alternative households. So if you remember back to the last lesson, so you could refer to communes, kibbutz, you could do one-person households, residential housing. You could refer to some extent, cohabitation or shared households. And then number 4, outline 3 reasons why diverse family types are on the rise. So there's a range of reasons, just to list a few. Secularization, so that's the decline of religion. You could say changes to the life cycle, feminization of the workplace, and just feminization of society in general. You could just refer to as well changing priorities. So maybe works become more important than having a family. There's a few there. And then what is the broad definition of the family? So if we remember, there's the narrow one where it assumes that it essentially gives a definition that is the same as the nuclear family, where it's parents and kids. And that's a really dated idea. The broader one is seeing the family or families as people in a household related either by blood, marriage, or common bond. Right, so jumping in. Before we go over the actual theories, and it's something we alluded to in that first do now question, just remember the difference there between the consensus and the conflict approach over the next 2 lessons. So the consensus approach, the functionalists who we're looking over today, they think that structures benefit society. So they think the family, that's a structure, that benefits society. Whereas the conflict approach, so whether that's a Marxist or a feminist theory, they think they reinforce inequalities, whether it be class or gender, and they think therefore that structures like the family are a negative thing. So just bear that in mind, because we're going to be looking at a lot of theorists, and if you were to choke in an exam or have a mind blank and forget, this is kind of your if in doubt moment, where you just essentially refer back to, well, is it consensus? Is it conflict? It gives you something to talk about, the basics. So first off, I just want you to write down 5 points. What does the family do for you? Okay. Now, this was aimed at doing it in pairs, but you do it on your own, just something that the family does for you. Okay, so pause the video and we'll come back to that. Right, so just to list a few things that a few of the students said in class. So students mentioned the family might provide you with emotional support. They might provide you with financial support. They might provide you with essentially the basics, somewhere to eat, somewhere to sleep and shelter. You could be sentimental, say about memories. Some students said about what it's a place to learn. So we're always learning things. And in fact, I think one student said about primary socialization, which is really, really key there. So just really to highlight the key things that the functionalists say about the family. So like I said in the previous slides, they see the family as a structure that has a positive contribution to society. So it's a part of that organic analogy. So if you remember, all the different organs are different structures and they all work together to function. In other words, to help the body to work. And the family is one of those organs. And that leads to this value consensus, these shared values that lead to this social cohesion where everything works. So this is especially the case in primary socialization. So that is your first couple of years and the most formative years of your life. So your childhood, essentially, and you growing up. And that leads to you learning norms, values, roles, all throughout that time. And there's two theories we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to be looking at George Murdoch and Talcott Parsons. So the first one, Murdoch, he suggests that the family has 4 functions. So first off the cusp, Murdoch was an anthropologist and he studied over 250 different societies. And he came to the conclusion, regardless of whether it was an isolated society or a modern industrial society, the nuclear family was always the dominant family type. And that's because it had 4 basic functions. That was the sexual function, the reproductive function, the educational function, and the economic function. So what we're going to do, I've got them on here now. I want you to read through them and just to essentially work out which one is the sexual, the reproductive, the educational, and the economic. Okay, so I'm just going to pause the video just for a couple of minutes, try and work out which ones are which. Yeah. Right, so I'm going to read through each one of those as we go along. Feel free to pause either at the end or for each one and just write down a short definition. So the first one, that was educational function. So that's where culture needs to be transmitted to the next generation. So children need to be effectively socialized. They need to be taught values, norms, roles of that society. So that is the process of primary socialization. So think of it in terms of where children learn to talk, where they learn their manners, where they learn their rules, both formal and informal. So it might be something as basic as knowing to open the door for people, or to say your please and thank yous, or to wait for everyone to finish at the dinner table. Okay, these are not things that we are just born with; they're learned. Even think about it. If you need an example, the fact that people in different parts of the country have different accents, even as children, that's because they're learning those accents. So the second one's economic function. So adult family members provide shelter, food, and money for their children. When families buy things to meet the needs of their children, this also helps to maintain the economy. So we take it massively for granted, whether it be food and shelter, but later on in life, it may be you getting help in terms of for another house, or it might be for your education, something like that, or maybe just something completely different. And then the next one's reproductive function. So society requires new members to ensure continuation of society. So it's just simply essentially people having children and passing on the next generation. And then that leaves the final one, so that's the sexual function. So marital sex creates a powerful emotional bond between a couple, and it encourages fidelity and therefore commits individuals for family life. So it encourages essentially monogamous relationships. So it encourages stability within relationships and therefore in society. So if we're seeing that our parents are in a relationship, then that might help us later on having a relationship. That may indirectly also help us, not the type of relationship, but just this idea of having stability. So if you see your parents arguing, knowing that, other relationships, whether it be at work, whether it be friends, you can also have arguments, but you sort it out after. Okay, so we're learning constantly through watching our parents and things like that. Okay, so you might want to pause the video now and just write down those 4 functions. Okay, and then we come on to Parsons. So we need to note down the 2 functions that Parsons talked about in the next 2 slides. So Parsons is probably the most famous functionalist, and he's really concentrating on the sort of American family of the 1950s and 60s. But he agrees with Murdoch. He says the nuclear family is the most important one, and it does have functions that benefit society. But he simplifies it further. He talks about just 2 main functions, and that's primary socialization, also known as the sex role theory, and then the stabilization of adult personalities, also known as warm bath theory. So that first one, primary socialization, it's just this idea that, that just as we learn norms and values in our society, we also learn and are taught gender roles. Okay, gender roles that Parsons argues, quite controversial today, that we are biologically suited for. So Parsons was arguing that men are suited biologically to be instrumental, to perform that instrumental breadwinner role. So to be masculine, to be independent, to be strong. And then women were biologically made to be expressive, so very emotional and passive, but to really be perfect for that housewife role. So that's the first one. You might want to note that down. Pause the video. And then the second one. So the second one here is the stabilization of adult personalities. And it's just this idea that the family absorbs all the stresses and hardship of modern society. So just like a warm bath is relaxing, the family is offering a safe place, a place of comfort, and a place of support. So that might be emotional support. So it offers social stability, and that stability it gives to you, it therefore rubs off into society as well. And you've just got an image there on the side, just sort of highlighting some of the stresses that are taken away. So just pause the video if you need to and note it down. Okay, so obviously you've not got a person with you, but just reflect on those ideas. What are wrong? What are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of a functionalist theory about the family's function in society? Okay, and then we'll go over that in a minute. Right, so there's a range of strengths and weaknesses here that I'm going to go through. Generally speaking, it might be worth just noting 2 strengths, 2 weaknesses. This is a bit overboard, but just so you have them all here. So you've got the new right here for the strengths. Charles Murray supporting this idea of the importance of the nuclear family. He says, yes, completely agree that the nuclear family is the most dominant, and sort of argues that we can see that that value in the nuclear family in its absence. So if we remember, Charles Murray talked about this underclass. He he argues largely that social issues are caused by this absence of fathers or mothers, of normal family types in his eyes. Okay, so traditional family types. So that theory obviously has issues in itself, but it is still theory, you could argue, that supports functionalism. And it does acknowledge the importance of primary socialization in terms of providing roles and things like that. But there's loads of issues with the theory. So firstly, it assumes there's no family dysfunction with the nuclear family. So things like domestic abuse or just being unhappy, things like that. Chill sort of highlights that by saying functional relationships can slip into dysfunction. That's something that's not acknowledged. There's also a critique about it not being very representative. The fact it's only looking at American families in suburban areas. So generally it's very middle class. So it's not looking at all classes. It's American, so it's not a global thing. And also think of the time it's writing, which is the next point. It's very dated. It's writing in the 50s and 60s. So that's not reflective of today's society, 60 years on potentially. And that's really reflected in Parsons' idea of the sex role theory, isn't it? In terms of the assumption about gender roles being biologically connected. It's very sexist. And then it neglects to consider diverse family types and them being functional. So it assumes that a single parent or cohabiting or same-sex families, it's assuming they can't function in society. And then you've got the general critique, if in doubt, just say Marxists would say it doesn't consider how the family reinforces class inequality, and how feminists would say how it doesn't consider the family reinforces gender inequality. In the next recording, next lesson, we're going to be looking at the Marxist and feminist approach to the family's function.